Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here in my thesis defense. My name is Mbali, and I have my partners here, which is Tatenda, as well as Betty. So I'd like to, okay, cool. So I'd like to take you to the study I did for the past 5 years, and I'll be presenting to you. It's a layman's talk, as you may know. And the title of my project is called Remote Sensing of Maize Intercropping, a Multi-Sensor Approach. And maybe some of you may ask, what is intercropping? Basically, intercropping is the planting together of 2 or more crops in the same field at the same time. It is one of the approaches that are very beneficial. And some of those benefits are that it lowers pests and manages diseases. It actually also then lowers the external inputs, which in the end reduces greenhouse gas emissions. Now, another thing about it is that if it's implemented well, it ensures against total crop failure, because the failure of one crop will be compensated by the success of the other. It reduces weeds, it also reduces soil erosion. It also increases soil fertility, and it produces higher yields. Now, if it is practiced, it actually uses land and water more efficiently, and overall it improves the quality of life. Now, going back to my project and understanding basically what we were trying to achieve, we know very well that the global population is expected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050, which then increases the food demand. And understanding such cropping patterns is actually crucial for addressing food production gaps. Intercropping practices can boost food production, but also they are often overlooked. So field-based mapping of cropping patterns remains rare. Few studies have been done focusing on these cropping patterns and also intercropping. So our motivation of the study was basically to look at intercropping and cropping patterns as a whole, so that we are able then, when we have such information, to track agricultural land use, estimate crop production, but also look into the crop water productivity. And ultimately, in the end, if we have such information, we are able to do food security studies, which actually influence policy. My study area was based in Kenya, in Busia, and the dominant cropping patterns or dominant crop types in the area, it's maize, which is commonly intercropped with beans and cassava. There are diverse cropping patterns in the region where the local farmer is basically a family member, is basically a father, a mother, a young adult in the area. And also then that influence what's happening in the field, because much of their cropping practices depend on the resources that they have, also depends on the size of the fields that they have. So we needed to understand basically what's happening there. Also, the whole region, it is a biannual region. What does that mean? It means that they've got 2 rainy seasons, which is the first season and the second season. So the first season is the long rain season, and then the second season is a short rain season. Our study was basically looking at the long rain season, where much of the farmers tend to invest a lot of their resources in. Now, when we look at cropping patterns and trying to discriminate them, there are a few things we needed to understand. We needed to understand the factors that influence the discrimination of cropping patterns using remote sensing. And one of them was the type of cropping patterns that we have. We have single cropping, which is just one crop type planted in a field. We have double and triple, which is more sequential cropping. And then we also have intercropping, where you have mixed, row, and also strip intercropping. And then another key factor that you need to look into is the crop calendar, because different crop types are planted differently, are planted different times. If you look at the crop calendar there, you can see that majority of the time cassava stays long in the field as compared to other crop types such as maize as well as beans. Another factor that we considered was crop characteristics such as maize height, or the height of beans, leaf canopy. All these different characteristics does influence how we can better discriminate different cropping patterns. Then we also need to look at cropping practices that are happening in the area, which I touched on earlier before, that it is quite important to understand the resources that farmers have, because they influence what's happening in the field. Now, after that, the objectives of my study I'm going to share here, but also you see that I'll share a bit about the resolutions that we need to look into in terms of remote sensing. The first chapter looked at the literature review, looking at what has been done, what are the gaps that are there in terms of remote sensing, and what is still need to be done. And one of the things that we did find in our chapter 2 was that there isn't a lot of studies that have been done that explicitly discriminate between maize and intercrop maize. So we needed to sort of try and understand how we can better do that, and we become explicit about the different cropping patterns that we have. And as we were doing that, we were then able to say, okay, we can use Sentinel-2, which is one of the open source data that we have. And using Sentinel-2, then we're looking at different spectral resolution, different temporal resolution. And from that, we're able to discriminate between just a single cropping pattern, which is just maize, from the intercropped ones. And the intercrop class will have different types of intercropping there. We're not really explicit when we're looking at that class. And then in our chapter 4, which was our second paper, we looked at hyperspectral data. There we focused more on the spectral resolution aspect of the remote sensing data. And there we were able to look at which spectral regions can we best do the discrimination of these two classes that we did in chapter 3. And then the last chapter, we then went in further where we looked at more very high spatial resolution. And from there on, then we tried to see how can we best discriminate further than just maize and intercrop maize, but also looked at maize and cassava, maize and bean, as well as maize and groundnut. So we successfully managed to do the discrimination of these different cropping patterns in this study. And the key findings here is that discrimination is possible. And we've also figured out that at the early crop growth phases, that's where you're able to do the discrimination. In this case, especially for chapter 3, it was in the vegetative phase that we're easily able to do the discrimination. And then another part that we did find was that the spectral region of discrimination that were important for the study was the red edge as well as near infrared. So these are some of the results that we got that showed us that the spectral reflectance of maize and intercrop maize are actually different when you look at them over time at the vegetative phase. And then in chapter 5, what we saw there is that at the vegetative phase, we were able to see that that was the phase where there was a high variability where we were able to do the discrimination of different intercrops. Now, getting into the end of my presentation, even though I feel like I rushed through it, from the study that I've done, one of the things I do recommend, also from the experience I had in the field, was that there really is a need of collaboration with local agricultural research centers, universities to gain better insights as well. But also we need to use simple data collection tools by encouraging farmers to share real-time information via mobile apps in terms of what's happening in their field, because there's quite a lot of variability in the field that's happening. As much as we were able to do the discrimination, there was quite a lot of variability that we saw that sort of impeded the quality sometimes of the classification results that we got. Also, we realized that there should be an integration of various data sources, including soil quality data, weather pattern, as well as historical farming records. Also, we needed to optimize remote sensing technologies by selecting sensors that improve crop pattern discrimination, as we have seen in the study that different sensors do provide us with different kind of information. And lastly, we needed to also promote open data sharing through different platforms like World Cereals to enhance farming data as well as food security. Now, in conclusion, the accurate discrimination of cropping pattern requires careful consideration of field information such as field size, crop calendar, growth phases, but also relevant image acquisition dates and appropriate remote sensing sensors. Thank you.
Please be seated.
I open this public meeting of the Doctorate Board of the University of Twente. I would like to express my welcome to all of you, in particular to the family and friends of the candidate and to the candidate and her parnims. A special welcome is extended to the members of the committee, and I'll introduce them to you. Online we have Professor Romulo from the University of Pretoria and South African Space Agency. Welcome to the University of Twente. Also online, Dr. Begay from CIRAD. Welcome to the University of Twente. Also online, Professor Kooistra from the University of Wageningen. Welcome to this event at the University of Twente. And then in the opposition we have Professor Jetten, Professor Surita Mila from the University of Twente. And the promoters, Professor Nelson and Professor Darwish, sitting next to me. Now that we know everybody, almost everybody that is acting in this defense, could the candidate and her parnims come forward, please? Dear candidate, are you ready for your defense?
Yes, I am.
That is very good to hear. May I ask Professor Jetten to start the opposition, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear candidate, thank you for a very interesting thesis. I read it with pleasure, and it's good to see that every new research in agriculture dives us a little bit deeper in what we can do with remote sensing. I also appreciated that you did a lot of farmers' interviews, but I would have liked to see a bit more about the background of these farmers, and that triggered a few questions for me. You mentioned at some occasions that field size may be a thing in your classification, and then it occurred to me that if farmers live together in a village and they talk to each other, that they may wait for the first rain and then all start planting at the same date or in the same week. And then field size doesn't matter anymore, right? Because the whole valley, so to speak, starts the planting and the growing of maize in this case. So how important is field size then when the vegetation activity starts at roughly the same date?
Highly Leonard opponent, thank you so much for your question. I'd like to first explain that ideally that's what you think. You think that farmers communicate with each other, they plant at the same time. But in this case, they relatively do plant around the same time, but their planting also depend on the resources that they have, right? So much of the time, yes, they will know that, okay, the first rain season is coming, and then they'll sort of start preparing their land for that. But the planting, I heard you asking also the kind of a farmer that is there. A local farmer in Kenya is basically a family member. It can be a father, it can be a mother, it can be a young adult. And because of that, that also diversifies the kind of practice or the kind of planting that's happening in the field. So it's good to say that, yes, they plant around the same time, but doesn't mean that at the end of the season, you'll see the same produce or you'll see the same uniform fields that you would normally see in, let's say, for example, a commercialized farm. So in this case, that was not necessarily the case. So I do feel then it is important that the size of a field is actually considered in such studies.
Thank you. Very clear answer. You mentioned, it's a nice bridge, you mentioned farmers have different means to do things, maybe different education. One of the biggest differences you see between the intercrop maize and the maize is in the vegetative state. There you see the difference in the reflectance or in the different indices. And then it occurred to me, but if the monocropped maize is more commercial farming, then maybe these farmers also have more means, apply more fertilizer. And so we're not necessarily looking at intercropped versus non-intercropped. We're looking actually at poverty is a big word, but let's say the farmer himself, whoever does can you unravel that? Can you distinguish between that?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, it is quite interesting in the fields in Kenya because both farmers who were doing single cropped and those who were doing intercrop, they were both using fertilizers. So the quality of the soil in the region is very poor. So they really depend on fertilizers for them to grow their crops even when they're intercropping. And despite the fact that I do share the benefits of intercropping in this study, but ideally in the end, those benefits, when they are implemented well, meaning that the conditions are met in terms of soil quality and basically what's happening on the ground, then you're able to see those benefits. But in the case of Kenya, that was not necessarily the case because the soil quality was not that great. So farmers who were intercropping also had to actually use fertilizers,
Okay.
meaning that the study itself was looking at fields, both intercropped and non-intercropped, what the farmers were using fertilizers.
And we can rule out this.
Yes.
Okay, okay.
Yes.
Also, thank you. That makes things a bit clearer. I was wondering, I have a PhD student from Ethiopia. She's looking at food security, and one of the things she finds is that it's also about, it's not necessarily the amount of food, but also the quality of the diet. And I was thinking, is intercropping gives you potentially a richer diet because you have beans and you have other nutritious crops. Could you use, and we're always looking for indicators for an area whether there is a food security problem. Could your intercropping results be used as an indicator to see who in a village or who in an area has a better, potentially a better or less food security problem?
When we compare, are you asking when we compare single and intercropped?
Yeah, or maybe areas with a lot of intercropping could potentially have a better diet, or is that a bit of a step too far?
Yeah, absolutely. Majority of the farmers that do intercropping is because they do want to diversify in that case. And you also saw that those who are more single cropping or planting one crop type, which was maize in that case, they would normally sometimes take half of it and actually sell it. So I think much of the motivation for the intercropped farmers were mainly to diversify.
Okay. Something completely different. I'm working on a study on nature-based solutions for flooding and runoff erosion. And one of the things that people are trying for years is to have in the landscape between the maize these grass strips, like meandering lines following contours of either another crop or also permanent vegetation like hedgerows or permanent grass. And we also want to monitor the quality of that. But the bands are very narrow, like 2 meters, 5 meters. And I saw drawings in your thesis of, linear intercropping or mixed intercropping or random.
Yes.
How well can you distinguish like thin line elements in the landscape? Would that be a lot of mixed signal or?
Thank you so much for your question. I guess also my topic is multi-sensor, so we need to look at different sensors to be able to see what best can we do. And the last chapter basically looked at PlanetScope, which has a very high spatial resolution, and I believe that's one of the sensors that you can consider for such a study that you're doing.
And it has also, we can, the difference between the permanent vegetation of such a grass, of vegetation strip and the maize, that would also help, I guess. Or
Yes, yeah, it will.
Is there a way to find out, because these things establish over 3 to 5 years, that you can see the development of it over the years?
Okay. You see, I considered PlanetScope in that area, but depending on how large also the project is, because if you are going to use PlanetScope, which is somewhat a commercialized software and it has very high spatial resolution, yes, but if you want to do it for long term and on a large scale, then maybe you might want to consider other ones as well, other sensors. Maybe Sentinel-2 also you can consider. Depends on how big the fields that we're talking about in your case. But in terms of temporal resolution, I think Sentinel-Scope still stands a chance.
Okay. Time for a small or not? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your answers.
Thank you, Professor Jetten. Are you satisfied with these answers?
Yes, I am.
That's very good. May I ask Professor Ramulo to continue the opposition, please?
Dear candidate, thank you, Chair. Dear candidate, it's really a pleasure to be in your defense. And you've done very interesting work. And then some part of this work is published, and I want to commend you for that. And the topic is very important, especially for most of developing countries. Again, looking at the fact that we are also affected by climate change and all these other shocks, but it's very critical to start coming up with, methods that can be used to detect this intercropping. But I just want you to reflect for me on just your high level, your study, you talk a lot about, shortage, limited data sets in those areas where you were working, and then I presume it could be the same in most part of Africa. And now if you look at it in terms of developing an agricultural monitoring system, how do you think your study will assist to that level where you have some operational systems, if we just think beyond your study, but and more on the applicability of your results? Thank you.
Highly learned opponent, thank you so much for your question. One of the key challenges we had in the study was that of limited data set, but not just limited data set, but also the quality of the data that we had. And I think I also continue to wonder in my head that if we were to then do this again, what will I do differently? And what can I take from this experience that I have? And as much as I think even if, let's say, I can have a lot of data that has all the kind of information that I have, but I think what still remains, it's basically what's happening on the ground in terms of the farmers, how they're supported, and the resources that they have, because that's what creates the dynamic or the diversity that we see in the field. But based on the experience that I've seen, I believe that if there can be a whole lot of collaboration in how different data sets are being collected by different organizations, by different research centers. There are a lot of different research. I hear that you come from the University of Pretoria. There are students that do such work as well. So they should, I think, in some kind of way, have a standard way of collecting data, so that when we consider doing collaborations on how can we come together and bring data that can help move, let's say, the sub-Saharan region forward, then we know the data that we are dealing with is standardized in a way. So looking at the work that I've done, I believe that we can really see the importance of field data that is standardized and is actually of good quality.
Mm-hmm. No, great. And also, data sharing mechanisms, as you mentioned.
Yes.
Yes, the other one is that I'm seeing that you are using a lot of machine learning methods, which is also very exciting. I know this is now in the era of fourth industrial revolution. People are using all these complex methods.
Yes.
But I just want to find out from you, of course, I know you've done a review, but I really want to find a reflection on, why were you often inclined to using random forest, and then on top of that, you can also reflect on, what are the major requirements for these sort of methods, and then maybe the last part, you can just tell me how you sort of implement it in your study to avoid a lot of challenges like overfitting, multicollinearity, and so forth in your classification. No, thanks.
Thank you so much for the question. I think the approach of the study first wanted to understand, can we do the discrimination? And it was important for us to look at the basic understanding of the different spectral reflectance of these different patterns that we're looking into. And from that, we're able to see that, okay, we can do the discrimination, right? And then secondly, we needed to consider the data that we had. The field size that we had was good enough in some chapters, but in others, not necessarily so. So we then had to look into that as well, looking at that. So we considered the results that we had when we were doing the spectral behavior of the different cropping patterns, but also looked at the data that we had and see what's the best thing that we can do. But also looking at the review that I've done, I saw that quite a number of studies did use random forest and they did get a lot of good results. Yeah, some they will also explore deep learning methods, but when it came to that, I realized that it was more on a generalized approach where people are not looking at field-based, but they're actually looking at more large-scale generalized vegetation mapping. So I think in our case, much of the information came from the basics of we now know that there is a difference between the 2 cropping patterns or the 3 different cropping patterns that we're working with. But also based on the data that we have, what can we best use? And we then concluded on using random forest.
Yes, now maybe the last part of how do you implement such methods in a way that you avoid quite a number of problems, like overfitting and maybe multicollinearity, because you're using, for example, yeah, but that would be my other question. Maybe answer that one.
Yes. In terms of implementation, I think I'll sort of continue going back to the basic factors that one needs to consider when they're doing such a study. You know, the first thing that we considered was that was the best time for us to do the discrimination, the type of spectral regions that we had, the best indices for us to be able to do the discrimination. So we looked into all of that. We looked at different vegetation indices. We looked at different spectral regions, and those that were best for us to use for discrimination when we're doing analysis are the ones that we used to implement the model. And I think the advice I would give going forward in terms of what can I sort of, if someone were to use such a study, what they should consider, it really is on the ground, because once you're able to understand what you're doing from the ground, then your results will show you what you actually have put in. You know, I think there's that whole garbage in, garbage out. So I think it's the same approach here.
Okay, Don, that's good. The importance of also, you know, feature selection and all those type of things. But do you also believe, do you agree with me that these methods are they are big data sort of driven type of data? You know, you need to have multiple explanatory variable and not maybe just few indices and so forth. Maybe that is why sometimes when you start using indices, you see that your methods are performing poorly in the classification. Have you noticed that? And then do you think is the number of bands, or I would say, if you look at it in regression, explaining variables? Thanks.
Thank you for your question. Well, there are quite a number of variables as well that actually when we went to the field would have loved to collect, such as leaf area index, chlorophyll content. But based on when we went to the field, we didn't manage to do that. So those are some of the variables that one would consider, because they're quite important for us to better understand what's happening in the field. But in this case, we worked with what we had.
Okay, no, thank you. The other one,
Professor Romulu, there's time for a short question and a short answer.
it's a short one. It's a very short one, Chair. Thank you so much. Okay, dear candidate, maybe you go to table 3.4. Yeah, what I wanted to see there, because you presented your results there showing the overall accuracy for mapping maize and intercropping maize from 0.86 for all the bands, 0.79 I think selected bands, and then indices was 0.56.
Yes.
Then how do you then select which method was the best here? How did you select that to say this method is the best statistically? I know you mentioned the F scores, but can you explain for me?
Well, based on this table, we can see that the overall score for all spectral bands, including the significant spectral bands, performed better. Even the F1 scores showed us that. So we looked into that and looked at the kappa coefficient as well that gave us sort of an indication. And these results also were quite interesting because, I mean, if you include all spectral bands, you also include the spectral bands that notably are not necessarily known for giving us a lot of discrimination when it comes to such. But in this case, they actually helped us to do the discrimination.
Yes, that's what I was asking about, the way you implemented the methods. But thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you, Professor Romulu. Are you satisfied with these answers? Perfect. May I ask Dr. Mahlayeye to continue the opposition, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And thank you, dear candidate, for your work. That is very important to better know, to have better knowledge of the smallholder agriculture, especially in Africa, as it was said before, and also because it was a very challenging research for remote sensing, and you agree, I'm sure. In fact, I have three main questions. The first one is about the practices, and again, congratulations for your huge field work. If I understand well, you did field work in 2022, and
Yes.
You process data or you interpret data acquired in 2019. And so you made interview. And so I wanted to know how confident you are about this data you collected. And perhaps a way to explain is to give me some details about the interannual variability of the practices in terms of intercropping, in terms of calendar time, etc. So,
Highly learned opponent, thank you so much for your question. The data was collected in 2022. Much of it is because I couldn't really go to fieldwork earlier on because I was one of the students that were affected by COVID. So the plan was to go a bit earlier. I had secondary data from 2019. So before I went to the field, I already had an idea of the fields I wanted to visit, and I wanted to understand what's happening on the ground. And I already started writing my chapter 2. So there were a lot of things that were not making sense there. So when we got to the field, we had very ambitious plans of how we're going to do field work and understand different intercropping patterns in the field. And it was quite a challenging exercise when we got there. I think one of my supervisors wouldn't believe us, every time when we had to share what we find when we are there. But in maybe let's say the first week, we went a little bit late as compared to when we were supposed to go to the field. So by the time we were there, it was somewhat sort of almost the end of the first season. And we saw that the farmers that planted on time and late still had their fields on. And then the ones that are early farmers had already started preparing their land or their field for the second season. In terms of how confident I am with my data, when we were doing the interviews in the first week, we were like, okay, we understand what's happening based on the plan that we had with the data that we got from secondary data. But we then realized that it was taking us somewhat almost, to fields that what we thought was there was not there, and sometimes farmers will not necessarily recollect well. But we then said, you know what, let's go and interview farmers. Let's make sure that we interview a whole lot of farmers so that we then have a better understanding what's happening in the field. And that exercise gave us an impression of the farmers that could remember, of the farmers that, because also even when we were there and the farmers will tell us what they planted in that first season, I would then be like, okay, but you are having potatoes now, and you said you didn't have, and then they'll be like, oh, no, actually I decided to plant this after I harvested beans. So you then started realizing, I then started paying much attention to that some of the information that may give us may not necessarily be accurate. And I think then what then happened when we came back is that we came back with a whole lot of interviews. I think there were about 300 interviews that we came back with. But ideally, in the end, when we ended up doing the classification, they were quite less. And it was because of some of those inaccuracies that we sort of got. When I was doing the analysis, I could easily tell that, okay, because we'll note also in our form that, okay, with this farmer, there were certain things that they were not sure about. Or some of them will say, oh, I wasn't here in 2019, so we'll note that as well. So we paid much attention to such information so that when we were doing analysis, it was actually clearer and easier for us to consider those that gave us better information and those that were not sure, and also those that didn't know what happened around that time.
Okay, thank you. And a very short one, during these interviews, did they mention the role of the rainfall pattern? For instance, if the year is very rainy, so there will be probably more weeds that if it is not, because in your manuscript you don't speak too much about the rain and the impact of the rainfall pattern on the discrimination between intercropping and monocropping.
Yeah.
What is your...
Yeah, I didn't speak much about it because I guess when you look at the remote sensing data, you are able to somewhat also see the impact of that. But there were, of course, a lot of complaints around that, the rainfall is no longer the same as before. It's not reliant, it's sporadic. They can't really do much, especially when it comes to investing in their fields. They can't really invest like they used to before because the rainfall patterns are no longer as reliable as they used to back in the days. So we did consider that as well, but I agree, it wasn't really much of a main factor in this case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, which is much more technical, I would say. So you got Sentinel-2 and Planet Time series acquired during the same year. And you got images Sentinel-2 in April the 12th, and the Planet in April the 18th, or something. And when I look at the NDVI, the mean NDVI values for maize, they are very different. One is around 0.4 and the other one around 0.6. Have you compared the values of NDVI from both time series? And can you have an explanation about this difference?
Yes. So for Sentinel-2, if you also look at the data, I'm understanding you're asking about the NDVI values of what, for maize?
It's an average, yes, for maize. Or in average.
Okay.
It's an order of magnitude.
Yeah. So because the chapter 5, when you look at it as well, the sample size was quite small. So I do believe that might have affected the results that we got for the spectral information in terms of NDVI. And then for Sentinel-2, we had quite a number of data sets that also helped us to understand what was happening. So I believe for the first, for Sentinel-2, you're saying it was lower? I don't have it with me.
For Sentinel-2, no, it's 0.6, and for Planet, it's 0.4.
Yeah, so for Sentinel-2, we had quite a lot of data for Sentinel-2 to actually understand what's happening on the field. But for PlanetScope data, the field size that we had there was reasonably smaller as compared to the study that we did for Sentinel-2. I would assume that's one of the reasons why that would be the case.
Okay. And I think I have just one last question. You mentioned often in your document, and I believe it, that the temporal information is very important.
Yes.
But most of the time, you do monodate classification. You choose one date.
Yes.
So why didn't you use a whole time series?
Yeah, thank you for your question. When we were using the temporal resolution, we used it to first check the spectral behavior of crops over time. Right, so we actually looked at a discrimination over time in different crop growth phases. So at the beginning, at the emergent stage, the vegetative state, up until the end of the season. So we were able to see that at the early phases and at the very late phases, there wasn't much discrimination, meaning that those are the phases that are actually able to get a lot of spectral mixing. So I didn't see that to be wise to add such data into a classification method or approach.
Have you tried?
No, in this case, for this study, I did not.
Okay, thank you. I think my time is out. So thank you very much, dear candidate.
Thank you, Dr. Begay. Are you satisfied with these answers?
Yes, I am.
Very good. May I ask Professor Koistra to continue the opposition, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Dear candidate, I read your PhD thesis with great interest. And the use of remote sensing to support the development of sustainable production is a critical topic, and the use of mixed cropping systems is already practiced globally in many regions and countries like Kenya, and since several years also has become a more prominent avenue for West European agriculture. However, in these spatially and temporal diverse cropping systems, the use of remote sensing becomes challenging, as you show in your thesis. And that's why your research is very timely. I would first like to have a look at your chapter 3. We already have been discussing a little bit about it, but in that chapter you evaluate the cropping pattern discrimination between maize and intercropped maize fields.
Yes.
Could you tell a little bit more about the size of the fields and how you extracted the Sentinel-2 based reflectance values per field?
Okay. I think I'd like to also refer you to okay, it's not here. So much of the field sizes in the region were, we did visit some fields that had less than 2 hectares, but we got to a place where we said we are going to visit as much as we can for field information, basically gathering field information from farmers. And we trusted that the field data that we will collect will help us to do the analysis later on. So when we came back, okay, so when we were in the field, we were using GPS. We also used the map maker to help us delineate the different fields while we were there. And then we came back, we extracted that data, we put it into shapefile. And then when we were using Sentinel, we knew that we can't analyze a field that's less than 30 by 30 meters. And I guess it goes the same with hyperspectral as well as the last chapter, which is PlanetScope. So we then extracted fields that were above 30 by 30 meter pixels when we did our analysis.
So in that sense, you used a minimum size in order to make a selection of fields.
Yes.
And did you also, but still there could be mixed pixels at the edge of the field, the influence of trees and hedgerows. How did you deal with that?
We tried to avoid a lot of fields that had such, and also it's quite interesting to see that a number of farmers do that, where they actually would put a tree at the center of a field. So we'd evaluate the field. If the field was big enough, we will take it, but also delineate now the tree, because we knew that it will influence the spectral information that we get. So we tried to do that. But in those fields that were quite small, we honestly ignored those ones, because we knew that the spectral signature of that, it will probably be a pixel or 2, which may, if you separate that, then you will be left with quite a very small amount of field, or pixel size, I guess.
Pixels within the field,
Yes.
And then you took the average of those pixels.
Yes.
Yeah, and then in figure 3.5, you show the spectral curves for the two classes, for different phases of the growth of the maize.
Yes.
And yeah, to a certain extent, for most of the phases, in fact, the spectral curves looks quite the same. Only for the vegetative phase, and there are some clear differences. How do you explain this?
Okay, so we're starting from the first plot.
Yeah, you don't need to, more general.
Yeah, okay, okay. All right. So, I mean, at the beginning of the growth phase, it's March, April, right? So that's when the farmers are starting to plant, and that's where it's sort of like it's more of emergence phase that's happening around that time. So you're not planning to really see much, both for maize and intercrop maize. Because what we've noted also is that even the intercropped farmers, they will plant the same as the farmers that are just planting maize, right? So they'll both plant around the same time. So whatever is happening in the field around that time is almost the same. So that is why you're not seeing much change that's happening in the field. But then
but can I interfere?
Yes.
Because
yes.
When you would like to distinguish the two types of crops, you would like to have some information in your spectral data that could distinguish the two classes.
Yes.
So were you... And when you achieved this result, were you surprised by it, or did you think, okay, this I can also clearly explain it?
Well, the not being able to see, I wasn't too surprised, because I knew there wasn't anything on the ground around that time, right? When we're thinking of how maize and different crops grow. So I wasn't really surprised. What really surprised me, though, was that the maize field maize reflectance was higher than that of intercrop, because initially looking at the theoretical information I had, I was expecting the opposite of that. But in terms of the discrimination, I wasn't even surprised. Even at the end of the season, you're able to see that, oh, but you still have high spectral reflectance. But because I was in the field and I did understand that the harvest may happen, but the plant will remain in the field, so you'll still see high spectral reflectance around that region. So going to the field really helped to bring an understanding of these spectral behaviors.
And then in the next step, you use random forest to discriminate between the two classes.
Yes.
And in table 3.4, which has already been mentioned before, you focus on the flowering yield formation phase.
Yes, yes.
Now there you get quite a good result of your model.
Sure.
But I was also wondering a little bit, based on the previous observation, did you also check which spectral bands were important to make this model? Because you already make a difference between all bands and significant bands, but random forest by itself also makes an importance, uses some features are more important than other ones.
Sure.
Did you check which are the important features?
Yeah, we did do that, and I think that's why you then are able to see your figure 3.6 and figure 3.7, where we looked at other indices, and much of them we actually were also informed by the spectral information that we got when we were looking at the spectral profiles, that the regions that were giving us a high variability or high discriminations were those from the red edge and the near infrared. So what we did then, we looked at indices that were from that region so that we were able to maximize on our results to make sure that we have maybe accurate or effective classification.
Okay. Then I would like to move to chapter 5 for a short question. And there you go to the high resolution data of PlanetScope. And there you also focused on spectral features for your classification model. But could you, for this type of imagery with a high spatial resolution, would it also not be interesting to get some information from the spatial patterns in your classification model? Have you thought about that, and do you see opportunities for that?
Thank you for your question. What do you mean by spatial patterns?
Now, for example, if you have a maize crop, then it's a homogeneous maize, but with intercropping you have other, you have row or different crop species next to each other, so that will give a different pattern in your image, which could help you to distinguish between the two different types.
True, it will. Thank you for your question. I think I highlighted also a little bit earlier that one of the mistakes we did, I guess, going to the field, we went a little bit later. And I believe had we gone earlier, we would have been able to pick up the different or dominant cropping patterns for different intercrops in the field. But we sort of missed that by looking at when we went there. But I do agree that probably that would also be a reason why we got differences in the spectral behavior of our cropping patterns.
Okay.
Yes.
And could it also help you to make this distinction? And so could the spatial patterns also...
Professor Koostra, can we round off the discussion with a short answer, in view of time?
Yeah, it definitely would have helped. It definitely would have helped. In this case, I don't necessarily know because I didn't know the spatial patterns in the area. I couldn't see those in my results.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for the answers.
Thank you, Professor Koostra. Are you satisfied with these answers?
Certainly.
Very good. May I ask Professor Sarita Mila to continue the opposition?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear candidate, I very much enjoyed reading your PhD thesis and learning about the potential of Earth observation sensors to map and monitor complex cropping systems. And I particularly enjoyed reading on your discussion regarding the impact of the spatial, spectral, and temporal resolution of these sensors. In the next few minutes, I would like to both clarify and maybe challenge some of the choices and maybe statements that you wrote in your thesis. But I would like to start with the title. Remote sensing of maize intercropping, a multi-sensor approach.
Yes.
I wonder if you really followed a multi-sensor approach. Could you please justify that to me?
Highly learned opponent, thank you so much for your question. Yeah, one can discuss that, maybe not, maybe yes. I think I'll just share that there was at some point at the end of submitting this thesis, I had said multi-resolution, and my supervisors were saying, you can't change your title right now. You already had multi-sensor, put multi-sensor there. But I think it still qualifies because I used 3 different kinds of sensors when I did the analysis of this work. But also multi-resolution would have probably also be a better fit, I think.
Okay. I guess you can guess the background of my question. For me, a multi-sensor approach will mean that in a given chapter, or to map these maize intercropping systems, you will have used multiple sensors simultaneously. Especially because now work in the area of big data, and we have access to a lot of sensors, and each sensor has some pros and some cons. So I think that in that sense, for me, using different sensors is not a multi-sensor approach.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But now let's change gears a little bit and move to chapter 6. Chapter 6 on page 118. Then there is the second paragraph where you said the study benefited from various machine learning classification algorithms such as support vector machines, random forest, and k-nearest neighbor. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
I'm wondering in which chapter you use support vector machines.
I think we can go to chapter. Let's see, chapter. Okay. I think thank you for the question, my high-level opponent. I think that changed. I was supposed to say decision tree rather than support vector machines, because for chapter 5, we use decision trees.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. When I was doing the finalization of the thesis, I sort of changed a bit from using support vector machine to using decision trees because it gave me better results in this case.
Okay.
So I made that mistake there. I apologize for that.
Okay, no problem. I got my attention because I was thinking about chapter 4.
Yeah.
In chapter 4, you use hyperspectral data, and I thought support vector machine would be an ideal method, but I didn't see it there. Instead, I saw that you use principal component analysis.
Yes.
And you wrote something like principal component analysis will be used to reduce the dimensionality of the hyperspectral data and to select the most important bands. And then I started to wonder, the most important bands for what?
The most important bands for us to help us do the discrimination.
But you cannot do that with a PCA.
Yeah, but what PCA does, it helps us to actually extract the better, I would say, better components that can best give us the best results for our model.
I would like to challenge that because with PCA you only focus on the variance.
Yes.
And I was wondering why not using some kind of feature selection or even feature engineering approach if you have multidimensional data, rather than using PCA, which is an unsupervised method.
Yeah, I don't think it's really completely wrong to use an unsupervised method in a somewhat more supervised approach, because we used an unsupervised method, but the results that we got from there, we then used it in random forest classification. Because we basically use PCA for just the reduction of noise from the hyperspectral data that you might receive.
Yeah. But you could have used support vector machine directly on the hyperspectral data rather than reducing the number of bands. And also with this reduction of noise, you're also eliminating some signal. Would you agree with this suggestion, or did you try
I would agree. Okay,
then maybe we can go back quickly to chapter 6 again.
Okay.
Let's move to page 127. There, at the end of section 6.6, I'm getting there, you write, in this thesis, the limited sample size emerged as a significant challenge. Correct?
Yes. Which part is it?
127, first paragraph.
Oh, okay.
So we have discussed also, you have discussed with other opponents the difficulties of doing field work and so on. But I was wondering, in which ways could you have overcome the challenge of having a limited sample size?
Without going to the field?
Yeah.
Well, okay. I think I'll answer this on a general way. One of the things I sort of did try is that I know that in Kenya they are continuously collecting data. There are different organizations that continuously collect data.
Yeah.
And I tried to reach out to some of the colleagues or organizations that do that, but I realized that there was a lot of restrictions when it comes to such data. So on a general approach, I'll say being open to find other institutions and organizations that actually collect such data so that you can add on to the data that you have. I don't know if I would consider using very high images to increase the data because of I don't know what's happening in the field. The data I used, I was confident in terms of what's happening in the field. So it would be quite interesting to look at, I don't know, very high UAV data and look and see what's happening. But then if you are going to do that, then you should be able to do that temporarily so that you're able to see what's there. So that's why I'm not confident to give that as an option in this case.
Okay, for me, this is a very nice answer. I was wondering why not using synthetic data. So why not do, completely fabricating your own data and using a Redis transfer model, for instance?
Yeah, that's one of the things I saw.
Thank you, Mr. Beadle. Thank you, Master of Ceremonies. Thank you, Professor Surita Miller, for a nice scientific discussion. Can I ask the candidate and our parnims to take their seats in the audience, please? I adjourn this public meeting of the Doctorate Board of the University of Twente.
Please be seated.
Ladies and gentlemen, I reopen this public meeting of the Doctorate Board of the University of Twente. Can I ask the candidate and the paranims to stand before this table? The Doctorate Board of the University of Twente, represented by us, has examined your dissertation and heard your defense. The Committee of Deans has decided, in accordance with Article 7.18 of the Law on Higher Education and Scientific Research, to admit you to the degree of doctor. I request the promoter to carry out the appointed task. That was too early. Please rise.
Under the authority assigned to us by law, and on behalf of the Doctorate Board, I grant to you, Mbali Mahlayeye, the degree of doctor and all the rights that are attached to this degree. As evidence of this, we'll present to you this diploma, signed by the Rector Magnificus, the Secretary of the Graduation Committee, and your promoters, validated with the seal of the University of Twente. So there's a bit of a puzzle going on there. Okay. Oh, wait, we need to give this to Perfect, wonderful. Much more.
Still? Oh, of course. Dear learned Dr. Mahlayeye, let me congratulate you also on behalf of the university on your acquired dignity. From now on, you have the right to use the title of doctor. This title implies that society can rely on the quality of your judgment, that you will act with integrity and transparency, and that you will communicate independently about the results and the social relevance of your work. Value the doctoralis as an honorable distinction and a well-deserved prerogative, but always remember the obligations imposed by it towards the scientific community and society. May I ask Professor Davies to speak the laudatio, please? The other members can sit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear Dr. Mahlayeye, dear Mbali, today is a moment to recognize all that you have achieved and the journey you've taken to reach to this point in your PhD. I will never forget our first online interaction. After that interview, I was very happy to bring a cheerful, energetic, and motivated African woman on board. And that was very fulfilling. You entered your PhD with drive and commitment to contribute meaningful outcome to the livelihood of smallholder farmers in Africa. But your path was not without challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted everything. Soon after your arrival, you found yourself locked down in the ITC hotel, isolated, far away from family and colleagues, and trying to stay focused in a time of great uncertainty. Yet, you managed and adapted to those difficult circumstances. Your PhD qualifier took place in the middle of that period, held online while I was myself in a fieldwork in a remote area. it was not the ideal setup, but you faced it professionally, showing how determined you were to keep going. I remember the first time you presented your research at a conference. In our weekly meeting soon after that, you shared how several researchers asked you, how are you going to do this work? Not because they doubted you, but because what you had set out to do in your PhD was quite ambitious. It was clear that your work had sparked interest and relevance, and that gave you a well-deserved boost in confidence. Eventually, you made it to the field, a key turning point. Seeing the mixed cropping system in Busia, Kenya, firsthand gave you new depth to remote sensing concepts you had learned and reviewed. You explored cropping patterns, focusing on the most relevant and widely practiced cropping system among African farmers, establishing your research in the lived reality of the people it aimed to support. You also mentored 2 master students during your fieldwork. These teamwork and collaboration blossomed into lasting friendship. You weren't just doing your own work, you were helping others grow too. And that speaks to your generosity as a colleague and researcher. Your PhD journey also came with some personal and family challenges. There were moments that caused delay, moments that demanded more of you than anyone could have expected. But you didn't give up, no matter how difficult things got. In the final stage of your PhD, time was tight. Deadlines were sometimes stressful, and Andy and I, as your supervisors, were not immune to feeling that pressure too. But somehow, every time we reached the limit, you delivered. If this PhD were a football match, it wasn't a 90-minute game. It was more like a 99 minutes, and you crossed the finish line. We, Andy and myself, would like to thank the member of the graduation committee who are present in this room and are joining online for their time and effort to read and evaluate your work and for their sound scientific debate today. Congratulations, Mbali. This achievement reflects your resilience, your growth, and the quiet strength you carried out through every step of this journey. We are truly proud of you.
Thank you, Professor Darwish, for a very, very nice laudatio. Allow me to also congratulate you again on behalf of the University of Twente, on behalf of myself, and on behalf of the faculty ITC. I have 3 take-home messages and 1 message I take home today. My 3 take-home messages from this debate is that field survey is traditional. I think remote sensing is just as traditional as field survey, but we need both. We need field, we need remote sensing to understand each other. That's my first take-home message. And along with that, small is beautiful, but for remote sensing, small is still not very beautiful and difficult to manage. My second take-home message from this discussion is it's really also all about the farmers that benefit and that can do better farming, producing more goods, producing more quality goods. And I think that is also good for society. And my third take-home message is that in the end of the day, you made possible to reach also policymakers regionally and also globally. I think they should implement this in their policies to make sure it's done, farming in a more sustainable way. And the message I take home is that you are a good researcher, you are a good academic debater, and you are an intrinsically motivated professional on remote sensing, field surveying and farming. And it was an enjoyable session today, and I'm happy with the end of it, with your degree. And I wish you a lot of success in your scientific, academic, private life. And I do hope we see each other again somehow in the future, either as academics or either in other ways of collaboration. So do not forget your roots in ITC. Do not forget ITC. And I also like to thank the members of the committee. Without them, this would not have been possible. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your hard work reading the thesis. And it's also nice to see familiar faces again after a bit of time. So it's good that we catch up. Thank you very much for that. Can I ask the young doctor and her parnims to take their seats in the audience, please? Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to file out in a slightly different way. The beadle will be followed by the young doctor, the parnims, family, friends in the first row, cortege, and then the rest of you can file out and find your way to the reception to congratulate the young doctor. With that, I close the public meeting of the Doctorate Board of the University of Twente. Did anybody take the signs?
I'd like to thank the committee members for reviewing my work and also for being here today to defend, to help me defend it as well. Thank you so much.